In this video, we are going to see how can we chain multiple promises one after another. So say for example, if you want to create a promise, the way you do that is by using the new keyword in front of the constructor promise. That accepts a resolver function. That resolver function gets access to two functions, that is resolve and reject. So now we have a promise that can either get resolved or get rejected. So if we want to resolve it, so we can resolve it with a value like 5. And if you want to store this into a variable, you can call it 5 and store it here. Now, when you refresh it and look at the value of 5, you can see that 5 is a special object, also known as promise, which has a state of fulfilled and a result of 5. And we know that on any promise, we can add a .then handler, and .then handler is executed whenever the promise is fulfilled. So here, we'll get access to the value that the promise is resolved with, that is 5. So we'll say value, and here you can do whatever you want with the value. So for example, I'll go ahead and log the value. Refresh it. Now you see the message 5 inside console. When you look at the value of 5, the first thing that you'll notice, it is again a promise. Why is that? So we have a promise, then we are using a .then handler. Even .then handler returns a promise. What it means is, you can only use .then on a promise, right? So if .then will not return a promise, you'll not be able to chain another .then into it. So do you remember like using array methods? So you have an array that the value of that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here you're using map over it. You're getting access to number, and what you're doing is you're just returning num multiplied by 2. Just because map returns array, what you can do, you can chain other array methods like reduce or filter. So I can just go ahead and say filter. And here I'll get access to another value. And what we will do, if value is less than 8. Again, if you see, filter is going to return another array. So what you can do, you can just add another method like reduce on top of it. So can you see how you're composing these different methods to come together to act on the same value? So here we have an array, we are using map over it because map is an array method. Then map returns another array. Then we're using filter on top of it, filter returns another array. You can use reduce. So similarly, what you can think about promises is, you can only use .then on a promise. Here we have created a promise, we used our first .then. If it will not return promise, you will not be able to chain .then on top of it. Generally, whenever you're doing asynchronous programming, you will have to do multiple things one after another. So we'll go ahead, take a look at another example to understand this problem. And for that, we are going to use this method that we created earlier known as fetch. So say for example, you want to fetch this data of the user named Getify. So first you will get the collection of all the information here in the form of JSON. So the data that you got also contains a key named followers URL. That contains an API using which you can get the list of all the followers to this specific user. So now when you go to this URL, you will see that it has a list of all the followers that the user has. So can you see what is happening here? First we are fetching this data. After fetching this data, we want to fetch another list of data. So that is the reason we get composability by using .then. And .then returns promise, and because .then returns promise, you can chain and compose multiple .then to it. First thing we are going to do is to call this function fetch data, and we know it is going to return a promise. So we'll say data promise, and here the URL that we need to get data from is this URL. So we'll add the URL. Now as soon as you refresh it here and look at the value of data promise, you'll see it is a promise and that is pending right now. If you look at it after some time, you'll see it is fulfilled with some kind of data, and here we have access to the whole information. We know that fetch data is a promise. So what are the methods you can use on a promise? So the methods are dot then, dot catch, and finally. So here we are going to use dot then is because dot then handler is called whenever the promise is fulfilled. I'm looking for promise to be fulfilled. So here we will get access to the user info and we are just going to log the value. So we'll say console.log user info. So here when we look at it, we can see we are seeing a log message of the object with all the values. But what is the value of data promise right now because we have already used .then on it. So whatever fetch data is returning, so we know that fetch data is returning a promise as we can see it from here. But what is .then returning here? So when we look at data promise, we can see it is again a promise, but the difference between the promise that we saw earlier and the promise that we're seeing it right now, earlier the promise was fulfilled with the data of an object with the value. But here the promise is fulfilled with undefined. Why undefined? Because from here we are just saying console.log and console.log returns undefined, and that's why it is being fulfilled with undefined. What if rather than console.log user info, I return user info dot followers URL? What do you think will happen? Let us see. So here we'll not see the console log message, but what if you look at the value of data promise? You can see it is fulfilled with the value of user followers URL. So using this link, what we can do, we can get a list of people who are following this specific user as we can see it here. Here we can see fetch data returns a promise. And this promise gets resolved whenever onload is successful. It means it is fulfilled. And whenever the promise is fulfilled, dot then is called. And here we're getting access to user information. And what we are doing with this dot then is we are resolving this promise with the value of user info dot followers URL. So and that is the reason we are getting this URL here. So we can just chain on top of it because even dot then returns a promise. So whenever you add dot then on a promise, dot then always returns a promise object. So here, because it returns a promise object, I can use dot then again. So I'll get access to followers URL. And what I can do here, I can again use fetch data to fetch some data of the user here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to resolve this promise by returning a value from here. So from that then, to resolve a promise, you will have to return a value. So what I'm going to return is by calling whatever being returned from fetch data. And where is the URL coming from? The URL is coming from here. So I'll just add this here. So now when you refresh it and look at the value of data promise, you will see it is pending right now. But what if you look at it after a couple of seconds? So you will see that this promise is fulfilled, and in the result, you have a list of users, or you can think about all the followers. Now what I can do on top of it is I can just use dot then again. So if you look at the whole structure, so first we are fetching data and fetch data returns a promise. Because of that, you can use dot then on it. So inside this dot then handler, we are getting access to user information, and from here we are returning user info.followers URL. So from this promise, we are just returning the followers URL because maybe that's all I need. So whatever you return from the previous promise is what you get in the next promise. If you don't return anything, you'll not get anything. Say for example, if I don't return anything here, I will not get access to anything here. But now I'm returning after fetching data on this URL. So this URL will on load, it will resolve with the value of xhr.response and I'll get access to all the followers. And here I can say users and you can just log the message. Now when you refresh it here, in the starting, when you look at data promise, you will see it is pending right now. And as soon as data is fetched, you can see that a list of 30 users has been displayed here because of this console log. But look at it now. First we are returning a promise, dot then is returning a promise with the URL, this then is returning a promise with the data, but this then is not returning anything. So now data promise is a promise object it is fulfilled, but the result inside data promise will be undefined because we are not returning anything from our last dot then handler. So we'll clear it out, look at data promise, and here when you look at it, you'll see it is fulfilled, but just because you're not returning anything, it is undefined. So it is very similar to a normal function. When you call a normal function and it doesn't have any return statement, it returns undefined. Similarly, when you use dot then and you're not returning from there, the promise gets resolved, but the value will be undefined. Now, just because you're using dot then here, you can also add a dot catch to it. And how does dot catch work? And what does it mean is, dot catch will take care of any error happening in any of the promises defined above. Either it is coming from fetch data or it is coming from any of these three dot then methods. So whenever any reject happens, it goes to the nearest catch. So you can have multiple dot then and multiple catch, but whenever any resolve happens, it goes to the next. Whenever reject happens, it goes to the nearest catch. So here inside catch, we can say we get access to error and we can say console.log error. Or you can also say console.error, the value error. Now we are going to make this and refresh this here. What do you think will happen in console? First, it is showing an error saying error internet disconnected. Then after some time, you are seeing an error saying something went wrong. Where it is coming from? It is coming from this reject. So as soon as reject happened, the nearest catch will be called, and this catch is just logging a message. Something went wrong. So in this way, what we understood is once you return a promise, on that you can use dot then handler. Dot then also returns a promise. So using that, what you can do, you can compose functionalities to do multiple things when you're doing asynchronous programming. Another important thing that we also learned is you can use dot then, dot catch, and dot finally. And whenever anything gets wrong or gets rejected, it goes to the nearest catch. So not only you can have only one catch, so you can also have multiple catch like this. So whenever the promise above this gets rejected, this catch will be called. But whenever the promise above this gets rejected, this catch will be called. In simple terms, whenever any of the promise gets rejected, it goes to the nearest catch. If something wrong happens here, it goes to this catch. If something wrong happens here, it goes to this catch.